Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining NPR and Edison Research for this presentation of the latest update to the Smart Audio Report. And this is the Smart Audio Report for spring 2018. We've done a number of these collaborations with our partners at NPR. And this go around, we learned some really interesting things about the changes in usage patterns for people that are just buying these compared to people that purchased them for more than a year ago, and in ways that make a great deal of sense, and in ways that I think really help to enrich what we know and what we increasingly know about how people are using this technology. First of all, we know from the Infinite Dial earlier this year, in fact, at the end of January 2018, we identified that 18% of Americans 18 plus own a smart speaker, about 43 million people. Now that was up from 7% the year before, so it nearly tripled. And the interesting thing is the people that purchased them more recently are starting to look a little bit different to the people that first bought them. And that's, again, in ways that I think will make a lot of sense to people. This is called the Rogers Innovation Curve, and it is from this that the terms early adopter and innovator and things like that actually stem. And when we first updated the Infinite Dial research on smart speaker owners at about 7%, that really put smart speaker owners into that innovator and early adopter category. These are really first movers in this technology, and they had very specific uses for smart speakers and for voice assistant technology. Now this year, as we're up to 18%, we're really starting to get into what I think we could call the early majority. With so many of these devices in homes, multiple devices in homes, they're starting to reach a broader class of people, a broader category, both demographically and psychographically. And as such, people are using these devices for different things, and we're going to see that very clearly coming up. So for this research, we did an online survey of 909 persons who own a smart speaker. This is a national study that we conducted end of May to the beginning of June, adults 18 and up. And we tracked things where we thought appropriate from the spring 2017 and fall winter 2017 surveys that we also did in partnership with NPR. Now first, let's take a quick look at the overall demographics of smart speaker owners. And you can see it's pretty broad and pretty reflective of America. And you can also see that 22% of adults 55 plus own one of these devices. So they're really getting out there to people of all ages. And at the moment, smart speaker owners are 54% female and 46% male. Now, I mentioned before that we are seeing differences between the earliest purchasers of these devices and the people that have purchased them more recently. And what we see here in terms of these data are the people that owned a smart speaker for a year or more. We'll call those the first adopters. That's about a quarter of this sample. And the people that have owned a smart speaker for less than a year, we're going to call them the early mainstream. And that's about 3/4 of the sample. So for much of this report, I'm going to compare and contrast the first adopters, the first people to really get their hands on this technology, with the early mainstream, a larger group of people that have purchased these devices, often on the recommendation of first adopters or family or friends that purchased them first, and are using these devices somewhat differently. First of all, there are big age differences between the first adopters and the early mainstream, and the one that sticks out the most here, the earliest adopters, about a third of them were 55 plus. And this certainly makes sense when you think about the economics of smart speakers. The earlier smart speakers cost more. 55 and up have access to more disposable income in general. And so they were amongst the first to purchase these devices. When you look at the early mainstream by age, you can see that 18 to 34 bracket goes up by about 50%. So as less expensive devices have gotten on the market and there's been more advocacy of these devices, younger purchasers are snapping them up. We can also see the early mainstream starting to even things out in terms of gender balance also. With the first adopters, 58% were women. Early mainstream now, 53%. And this is certainly going to continue to approximate the US population as the market penetration of these devices and this technology increases. Now, the people that have more recently purchased these devices are more likely to say they're using them more often. And we're going to see that later on when we look at some of the activities and skills that they use. They're using them, frankly, for more things. That doesn't mean the first adopters aren't using them more often as well, though. About half of the first adopters say they're still using these devices more often than the first month that they got them, and that was at least a year ago. With the early mainstream, 54% say that they're using them more often. Now, in terms of how many speakers people own, certainly you would expect the first adopters to be more likely to own more than one, and 55% own more than one, and it's getting close to 3 in 10 that own 3 or more. But that does not mean the early mainstream folks have only purchased one device. In fact, 46% of the early mainstream purchasers also have more than one device. So that's a lot of devices. That's a lot of the application of voice assistant technology getting into multiple rooms of the house. And as a result, it's starting to become the way that people listen to audio most often. In fact, if you look here at the first adopters, the ones who are more likely to have multiple devices in their homes, the smart speaker is now their number one source of listening to audio, that green bar. 25% of the first adopters say the smart speaker is their number one way to listen to audio. And by the way, with the early mainstream, it's a strong second and really almost catching up with smartphone, tablet. So as these devices get into multiple rooms of the house, they are being used to listen to audio, and they're starting to become the way that most smart speaker owners are gravitating towards listening to audio. And they're not done with buying devices, by the way. 44% of the first adopters and 58% of the early mainstream users say they're going to buy yet another smart speaker for their household. Now, why do people want to buy another smart speaker? Amongst the people who say they do plan to buy one, the number one reason here is to control appliances or lights in more rooms of their house. And that's certainly a behavior that we saw quite strongly last year when we really were talking to the earliest adopters of this technology. But if you look at the number two reason, it's to listen to news in more rooms of your house. And one of the things that we have tracked in the infinite dial study over the past few years is the decline in the percentage of Americans who say they have a radio in their home. This is a very clear indication that people are using this technology to replace those radios in many cases, with 60% of those planning to purchase another smart speaker doing so to listen to news in more rooms of their house. And news turns out to be a very important driver of audio on smart speakers. 69% of first adopters and 72% of early mainstream users say that they ever listen to news on their smart speakers. That's a clear majority here, about 7 in 10 for both groups, are listening to news on their smart speaker. And when we ask people, which spoken word topics or style of programs would you be interested in listening to on your smart speaker? Number one for both groups, tied at 73%, is news and current affairs. So news is clearly a very strong driver for audio consumption on these devices. Here we can also see comedy at number 2. But look at the early mainstream when we start to look at other topics: music, arts, and culture, food, educational topics, mindfulness and wellness. So as we will see, there are expanded numbers of skills and activities that this group likes to enjoy with their smart speakers. And they also have fairly broad and diverse tastes in content. But news is number one. And when we ask both of these groups, how much time did they spend listening to news on their smart speaker? You can see here about 2/3 of the early mainstream say they listen to at least an hour of news on their smart speaker, with another 21% 2 to 4 hours and 16% 4 hours or more. The first adopters, by the way, also fairly high news consumption on their smart speaker. So it's already become a significant channel for news consumption amongst those who own them. Now we ask people what activities they have requested these devices to do in the past week. And as you would expect, the number one choice here is play music, and that's with both the first adopters and the early mainstream. These are still very much seen as smart speakers, even though, of course, number 2 here, get the weather, and number 3, answer a general question, are more about the voice assistant technology. You can see here on page 1 of this, and I'm going to go through 3 pages of this, set a timer alarm, check the time, get the news again, shows very high. In the past week, have you requested your smart speaker to get the news? 58% of the early mainstream and 51% of the first adopters say that they have done this. Page 2, and one thing that you can start to see here is that the early mainstream users, that 3/4 of this sample who have purchased their devices within the past year, are doing more things with them. They have a more diverse range of skills that they're using with them. You can see significant differences here in fairly mundane tasks like get the traffic, look up recipes, find restaurants or businesses in your area. While these are high with first adopters, they're significantly higher with the early mainstream. So they're starting to do more mainstream activities, which makes sense given where they plot on the Rogers innovation curve. These are, in fact, more mainstream Americans, and they're asking their devices to do more mainstream, average, typical, everyday activities. This third page here, you could see really about the only thing that first adopters heavily over-index on, and I'll break this down more clearly in a few minutes, is to control household devices. And this really makes a lot of sense if you plot where this group of people, where they are on the Rogers innovation curve. These really are early adopters. They're the most likely to say that they are the first to try new technology. So they certainly over-index on controlling household devices. They're more likely to have smart home appliances, smart home lights, and things like that, which I will show you again in a moment. And that is about the only thing that they significantly over-index on this page. You can see things like make a phone call, which is a pretty typical behavior, and play a podcast. The early mainstream purchasers of these devices are much more likely to say that they have played a podcast in the past week, 28%. And that really is because they're a little bit more likely to be podcast listeners in general. Now, both groups have significant podcast listening. 63% of the first adopters say that they listen to any podcasts, and 70% of the early mainstream. But the early mainstream much more likely to be weekly consumers of podcasts, 22% versus 16% of the first adopters. So significant podcast consumption amongst both of these groups. And this is a really fascinating tidbit. And I think part of it has to do with how difficult or easy it was in the early days, I say early days of a technology that's just really a couple years old, of listening, how difficult it was to listen to podcasts on smart speakers. There are still issues listening to podcasts on smart speakers, certainly going back through a library of previous podcasts or picking up where you left off. But skills are being developed for those things, and the companies that are developing those skills and the producers developing those skills are making it easier for people. And I think what we're seeing here is that the early mainstream are far more likely to probably have discovered those skills, because many more of them are listening to the podcast directly through their smart speaker rather than the behavior of starting it on a different device and then connecting it to play on the smart speaker, which is probably something the first adopters had to do for some podcasts, at least in the very beginning. But it is getting easier as skills are being developed, and we now see the early mainstream, 3/4 of them are starting the content directly on the smart speaker, compared to only about 1/4 that are not. Now, I mentioned earlier that the first adopters over-index for using smart home technology. Again, makes a lot of sense. These early adopters are tech-heavy, these first adopters, much more likely to use their devices to control home lighting, 24-13, more likely to control home security, and 5 times more likely to control outside lighting, sprinklers, or other outdoor equipment. So the first adopters really over-index for the super techie skills and the super techie behaviors that you can do with smart speakers. And that really makes sense. When we look at the weekly tasks that first adopters tell us that they do, and we index them to total smart speaker owners, only a few things over-index here. Control household devices is the big one here. It over-indexes at 14 compared to connect with smart speakers outside home and so on. And many of these other behaviors actually under-index compared to the total smart speaker owner. How about the early mainstream? Well, look what over-indexes here. Order food, get the traffic, look up recipes, make a phone call, play a podcast, play NPR, find restaurants or businesses. In other words, much broader, much more mainstream everyday activities. So this newer, more numerous group of smart speaker owners and smart speaker users are really using these for day-to-day tasks more often than the first adopters, who have more of a kind of confined skill set that they're using. They're doing everyday activities with them. And that's really clear when we look at activities by daypart. Now, these are indices. the top indexing activities by daypart. If we simply looked at the top activities by daypart, you would see music across the board. But these are the things that over-index for their daypart, and they make a lot of sense. The skills that over-index from 5 to 9, traffic, weather, and news. These are the essentials that people need to start their commute, to start their day, and these are the things that really over-index on a smart speaker. Now from 9 to 5, people are using them to order items, to conduct commerce, to listen to the radio, and to add something to a shopping list. Quick reminders for things they don't want to forget, especially during a workday. From 5 to 9, order food, find a restaurant or business, and play a game. So again, we're thinking with our stomachs from 5 to 9, and we're using them for entertainment. And finally, as people wind down for the night, they're using them for things that make a lot of sense, again, to control devices, to turn the lights down, to read a short story or play an audiobook. These are very classic wind down activities. So again, this is heavily influenced, obviously, by the early mainstream users. 3/4 of the survey is early mainstream users, and they're doing mainstream things with them. A couple of other things that we learned in terms of other uses and other behaviors associated with smart speakers. First of all, majority of both groups say they're listening to more audio since they got their smart speaker. 70% of the early mainstream, in fact, say they're listening to more audio since they got their smart speaker. Now, there's certainly some FOMO, some fear of missing out with people who own these devices. They don't know enough about their smart speaker to use all of its features. Interestingly, the early mainstream are more likely to agree with this, but as you can see, they're already doing more things. And then this last bit, we first discovered this in the spring 2017 Smart Audio Report, and it's still true to this day. For the people that have children in their household, they agree that the smart speaker has made it easier to entertain the children in their household. 62% of the early mainstream and 54% of first adopters say that smart speakers have made it easier to entertain their kids. And in fact, the early mainstream user is a far more fertile American, with 45% of them saying they have children in their household and 36% of the first adopters. So the people buying these devices now, more recently in the past year, actually much more likely to be parents. So some of the behaviors that we uncovered last year are true with even more Americans. Now, amongst those who have children in their household, 3/4 of smart speaker owners say that their kids use the smart speakers. The kids themselves use the smart speakers. We certainly have kids that that love to play games and do all manner of things with them. And this is a majority behavior amongst smart speaker owners that have kids in the home. So what do those kids ask their smart speakers to do? Well, again, the primary use case is music. 55% of parents with smart speakers say that their kids have asked to play music. We also have answer a question, tell a joke. We get that one a lot. Play a game. And this is my favorite. 25% of those with kids in the home that use smart speakers say they've used them to help with homework. And I have no doubt that an Alexa or a Google Home is probably going to replace me reading this webinar next year. But they're certainly extremely useful for educational purposes, and kids are starting to rely on them more and more. And it almost borders on science fiction, the questions that these devices can answer for your kids. Now, we saw in the first Smart Audio Report that there is significant advocacy. And again, we see that here, especially with early mainstream users. 61% of those say they've encouraged their friends to get a smart speaker. 55% of the first adopters and 54% of the early mainstream agree they wouldn't want to go back to life without their smart speaker because, again, they do a lot of everyday tasks that people have gotten used to. And this is something that we saw last year with the earlier purchasers, but now we're seeing it with the more recent purchasers even more strongly. 56% of the early mainstream say that since getting a smart speaker, they're using the voice-operated assistant on their smartphone more. And this is a super interesting behavior, that using these devices at home is actually getting people to use the technology more. And this is why it's super crucial for us to realize that what we're talking about here are not speakers. We're talking about voice assistant technology. And the ease of use and the fun and frictionless way that people can use them in their homes is kind of a Trojan horse to train people to talk to their computers. And soon we'll be talking to them in our car. Soon we'll be talking to appliances. Maybe they'll talk back to us. But it's going to be increasingly just how we get media. Because again, using smart speakers has trained us to go back and use this technology on the phones, and that is a much larger potential channel. And what we see with both first adopters and the early mainstream is they're extremely likely to use the voice-operated personal assistant on their smartphone, whether that's Google Assistant or Siri. 71% of the first adopters and 82% of the early mainstream say that they ever use the voice assistant on their smartphone. Now, this is a fascinating finding, a real key insight to this version of the research. Take a look at these two statements, especially with the early mainstream. 43% of the early mainstream say they purchased their smart speaker to reduce screen time, and another 41%, you or your family members talk to your smart speaker during mealtime. So we have these devices being used with people socially, and in many cases to actively reduce people's time with screens. This is a fascinating insight about smart speakers. And in fact, 33% of the early mainstream users and about a quarter of the first adopters say that they're spending less time with other technology, period, since getting a smart speaker, which is a pretty remarkable insight. Now, again, some of this has to do with the fact that these devices are strongly social. How often do you use the smart speaker with others in your household? 47% say most of the time, and 43% say occasionally. Almost nobody says never. So these devices are being used socially in the house, and that's when we don't want people looking at screens. That's when we want to interact with people. And here's a remarkable stat. 38% of the early mainstream users purchased their smart speaker actually hoping to reduce screen time. And again, 22% of the first adopters agree with that. So these devices are providing a way for people to use technology in their home that doesn't glue them to a screen so that we can still talk to each other and share a meal. So we asked, is the time you spend using your smart speaker replacing any of the time that you used to spend with these various forms of media? And you can see here very strongly, especially with the early mainstream. Well, the first one is AM/FM radio, which 40% of first adopters and 45% of early mainstream users agree with. But look at the next three: screen, screen, screen. 38% of early mainstream users say it's replacing time that they spend with their smartphone, 36% with their computer, 30% with their tablet. So they're being intentional about it, and they're actually doing it. They are using screens less because they're able to access this technology and to able to access their media and even to do search without having to look at a screen. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about today is commerce, and we certainly know that people are using these devices to make purchases. Very few people say that they have made zero purchases. About a quarter of early mainstream and 29% of early adopters say they've made zero. But you're starting to see people make 3 purchases, 4 to 5, 6 or more just in the last 3 months. And again, the early mainstream users are actually, on average, ordering more things than the first adopters, 2.7 items as opposed to 2.1. So people are using these devices to make purchases. They are using them for commerce. And we see some of these numbers really mirror strongly with what we saw last year. About a quarter of both groups say they've added an item to their cart so they could review it later. 37% of the early mainstream users say they have researched an item that they might want to purchase. And then again, we see pretty good numbers here for reordering an item they've previously purchased and ordering a new product you have not previously purchased. But again, as this technology gets baked into more things, i.e. baked into things with screens, some of those barriers to entry for purchasing new products will be removed. And the last thing I want to show you here today, before I see if there are any questions that I can answer, how would you describe your attitude about the following types of advertisements? And there's a lot of items on this list. I really only want to focus on the first one because it's significantly higher than all of the other ones. And that is skills or features created by brands. And most people don't mind it. And a lot of people like it. In fact, 22% say they like it, 59% say they don't mind it, and only 19% say they hate it. So in other words, 81% of smart speaker owners at least don't mind, and many in fact say that they like skills or features created by brands. So this is an important channel. It's an important media channel. It could be an important messaging channel. because right now people tend to be very favorable, people who own smart speakers tend to be very favorable about skills or features created by brands. So I think we're going to see a lot more activity along those lines in the future. So I will pause there, and first of all, we'll see if we have any questions. While I'm waiting, I would like to thank our partners at National Public Radio and National Public Media who help support this research and have been strongly behind gathering these insights and strongly out in front of people's usage of this technology. So we want to thank everyone at NPR and NPM. And I also want to thank my entire team at Edison who makes me look good, as they always do. And again, these webinars will probably be read by Alexa next year. Here's a question. In the slide about why people purchase the second speaker, did you ask about listening to music as a driver? Why all this focus on spoken word? Yes, to listen to music in more rooms of your house, 80% of the total said that. So that was certainly fairly high. Another question here. Smart speakers replacing mobile phone for certain tasks. How soon will that happen? I think what's more likely is that mobile phones replace smart speakers. And again, as people get more and more comfortable using this technology, they're going to start using it more on their phone. And the phone is what's in our pocket. So right now, I think people are, they're directing some attention towards the smart speakers. They're reducing their screen time. But when people realize that they can just yell, "Hey Siri," across the room and do a lot of the same things anywhere on the planet, that's going to start being done more. Same with Google Assistant. So that, I think, is a behavior that's going to increase quite a bit. What are some examples of brands that are doing great smart speaker advertising? Smart speaker advertising. And a follow-up, what do you mean by features and skills by brands? So there are some wonderful activations that I've seen and heard about on smart speakers. There was one, I believe, was done by National Geographic that actually built a suicide hotline skill for veterans that they promoted. And I think the way to look at this is to be of use and to be of help to people. One of my all-time favorite apps on the smartphone is Sit or Squat, which basically maps out over a GPS where you should poop and where you shouldn't poop, based on user reviews of public restrooms. Don't be in New York City without it. And that is a smartphone skill that was purchased by Charmin, which makes a ton of sense, right? So Charmin now owns that app, and it's doing things that help people in the moment, right? I think the ultimate example of this, and I don't think there's a skill for it yet, but there soon should be, will be the Butterball Turkey Hotline for any of you who have savagely destroyed a turkey, as I have. But it's things like that that can help people with their hands full in the moment. Those are the kinds of things that I think people welcome from brands. What is the universe of this research is a question. Adults 18 plus who own a smart speaker. And we've used, of course, our infinite dial data, which is representative national sample, to help weight and calibrate this data. But this was from an online survey of a little over 900 Americans, 18 plus, who own one of these devices. Let's see. Did you ask if people think they know all the features available from their smart speaker? Well, we asked something very close to that, which do they agree that they don't know enough or don't know all the features available? And well over half of the early mainstream agreed with that. So people, I think, know that they don't know. There are unknown unknowns. And let's see. It looks like there's one more question coming in. Hi, Tom. Thanks for this webinar. You are welcome. Thank the team at Edison and thank NPR. It's very interesting. I wonder if you know anything about how long users listen to news or podcasts. Do they prefer shorter briefings or longer? That's not something that we're going to get into in this iteration of the research. I do think people may have different preferences in different contexts, but that's not something we're going to get into in this particular release. Was a question asked if smart speakers have replaced general web-based search, i.e. Google search? We didn't ask if there's replacement behavior. We do know, we did just show the percentage of people who say that they're using it to ask a question, which is the number 2 use case of these devices. But but not if it's actually replaced a web search. That's a really good question. Is it unusual for the early mainstream to be more engaged with the product than the early adopters compared to other new product intros, e.g. smartphones? It may be slightly unusual, and some of that may be that for some, the first adopters bought it for a very specific use case, as opposed to I bought it because a friend recommended it. It sounded cool. They might also be adopting something else right now because that's what first adopters do. But I'm not surprised that more mainstream users are doing more mainstream things with these devices and have different needs. So that part I'm not necessarily surprised about. Any insights about attitudes towards push notifications? I know Amazon is piloting the tech with weather news and pizza delivery. Though I would love to have pizza pushed to me somehow. I don't have any particular insights about that. I think that requires a great relationship between brand and consumer. And I think the Amazon Prime brand has that with a lot of their users. But I think you'd better know that you have that relationship before you do that. All right, let's see. Don't you think early adopters will use smart speakers in the same way as first adopters after a year or so? Will they become more similar to first adopters, listening less to news, etc.? I'm not sure about that because these really are different people. They're different people age and gender-wise. They're different people psychographically. They're a lot more likely to have kids. They're kind of different dogs. So I don't know that I would make that assumption. All right. That looks like it's the end of the questions being fired in. So I want to thank the hundreds of people who tuned into this. My goodness, we had such a great response to this. And once again, I'd like to thank our friends and partners at NPR and National Public Media for partnering with us on this research. And on behalf of them and everyone else at Edison Research, thanks for listening.